Okay, panic over. There's always that sort of heart-stopping moment, isn't there, that we've all come to know and love. My name's Andy Chadwick. The title of my talk is The Hybrid Media System, Politics and Power. I'd like to congratulate Manuel Castells on being awarded the Holberg Prize. Manuel's work has been a wonderful inspiration to me over the years. I remember when I first started to research the internet and politics in the late 1990s. It was a lonelier time for us back then. And I read the entire Network Society trilogy from cover to cover, and what can I say? It absolutely blew my mind. I thought, wow, I'm never going to be able to match this. And then Manuel's excellent work in this field just kept on coming, and when his book Communication Power came out in 2009, I remember picking it up in the bookshop and flipping it over to read the jacket blurb on the back, as one does. And there was a wonderful quote from Russ Newman, which said, and it was first on the list, and it begins, "Castells has done it again." He was absolutely right. Thanks also to the Holberg Prize Committee for inviting us to such a great symposium, and the city and the University of Bergen for hosting us. My talk today is designed to give you a flavor of my new book. With a fair wind, the book will be out next spring, so I'm in the final stages of it right now. And in my 20 minutes today, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to present the book's main arguments and theoretical orientation. And then I'll very quickly walk you through an overview of what the book covers. And then I'll focus on a couple of chapters in the book that deal with power, interdependence, and hybridity in the construction of political news. So there's a lot more detail in the book itself, and there are some excerpts and some working papers on my website. So do please email me if you'd like to know more, because those are the sorts of emails I really like to receive. So let me start with the premise and the argument. So allow me to use a broad brush. This project really emerges from my growing sense of dissatisfaction with, on the one hand, some of the work on the internet and politics, and on the other hand, some of the work on older media, broadcast media, newspaper media, and politics. Things are slowly changing, but these two camps have too often talked past each other. Or worse still, they've completely ignored each other's central themes and contributions. And I've been guilty of this myself. I've written a lot about the internet and politics, and I've largely ignored broadcast and newspaper media in the contemporary period. There are lots of exceptions, of course, but it's only very recently that digital media and the internet have started to be recognized by what we might call those working in the historic mainstream of political communication scholarship. And on the other hand, a lot of the work on the internet and politics has also been problematic. It's mostly blind to non-internet media forms. It's too often dominated by assumptions about revolutionary change, or alternatively, on the other hand, by a too narrowly drawn frame of politics as usual. So as a result, I think political communication scholarship is in danger of losing some of its usefulness. We're increasingly detached from what's actually going on out there in the real world, I would argue, because we're not focusing enough on the interrelationship between older and newer media practices. So, my argument in this book is I'm trying to integrate the study of older and newer media in politics. We need holistic approaches to the role of information and communication in political life, ones that avoid exclusively focusing either on supposedly new or supposedly old media, but instead map where the distinctions between newer and older media matter, and where those distinctions are in fact now dissolving. And we also need to focus on what my colleague at Royal Holloway, Ben O'Loughlin, terms renewed media. In other words, how older media adapt and integrate the practices of newer media. And we also require systemic perspectives that discuss the structural characteristics of political communication, because it's now clear that media systems are in a chaotic transition period, and this is a transition that's set to last for a long time. I think the key to all of this is some sort of conceptual understanding of power, and one that can be illustrated empirically. So as you can probably guess, all of this is really, really hard to do. And I'm not saying I have all the answers, far from it, and you might not even think I'm asking the right questions. But I guess the secret is to have fun trying, and part of that fun, I hope, is what I'm calling the hybrid media system. So this is it in a nutshell, the argument. The hybrid media system is built upon interactions among older and newer media, their technologies, genres, norms, behaviors, and organizational forms. Actors in this system are articulated by complex and evolving power relations based upon adaptation and interdependence. Actors in this system create, tap, or steer information flows in ways that suit their goals and in ways that modify, enable, or disable action across and between a range of older and new media settings. So in a little while, I'll give you a quick overview of the book, and then I'll talk about what I'm calling assemblages of hybridized newsmaking in the political information cycle. And then I'll talk about WikiLeaks as an example, finally, of hybridity, power, and interdependence in the construction of news. So the main focus of my attention right now, today, is news. But in the book, I also look at election campaigning, and I also have some ethnographic data as well inside politics and journalism in Britain. But first, I want to take a little bit of an ontological detour, if you'll indulge me. So I want to talk about the ontology of hybridity. What does hybridity mean? Very, very briefly. Why is it important? What does it allow us to get into when we look at political communication that other ontological dispositions perhaps miss? Well, in the book, I start by sketching out this ontology of hybridity very, very briefly. I'm not a philosopher, I hasten to add. But what I did was I examined how the term has been used in the social sciences over the last 2 to 3 decades, and you can trace it back a lot further than that, in fact. But the conclusion I come to is that hybridity offers a very powerful way of thinking about politics and society, because it's a way of seeing the world that highlights complexity, interdependence, and transition. Hybrid thinking rejects simple dichotomies. It nudges us away from either-or thinking toward not only but also forms of thinking. And it draws attention to flux, to in-betweenness, the interstitial, and the liminal. It concerns how old and new blend and overlap, and how practices intermesh and co-evolve. So there are lots of examples in the book from, for instance, comparative political science, the notion of hybrid regimes, which has become popular over the last decade or so, governance and regulation, hybrid power and incentive structures. Organization studies has its literature on hybrid organizational norms, types, and structures. I've contributed to some of that. Communication, cultural, and media studies has plenty of stuff on hybridity, not in the way that I'm discussing it here, but there's lots of stuff on hybrid cultures and genres, and also Manuel's concept of mass self-communication, which is a wonderfully hybrid notion, if ever there was one. There's also science and technology studies, actor network theory, Bruno Latour et al., their theory of hybrid networks of human and technological agents that come together to create social forces. So in my view, hybrid thinking provides a good disposition for studying political communication because of these reasons. I'll now give you a kind of brief overview of the structure of the book, and then I'll talk in detail, a little bit more detail anyway, about 2 examples. So in the book, I basically have a section that's to do with theory and history. I look at the ontology of hybridity as I've just described, and then I also have a historical chapter which looks at the interaction of older and newer media throughout historical periods going back to the 15th century. And when I did this slide, I thought, how can I summarize what's, first of all, a very kind of brief and arguably not particularly detailed history compared with book-length studies? How can I summarize this in one PowerPoint slide? So I went for the eclectic approach, as you can see. But I'm interested in this chapter in the notion of hybrid media and social and political practice, and how the two co-evolve and intertwine, and how important periods of transition from so-called dominance by one form of medium over another are actually much more complicated and messy and chaotic than we would previously have assumed. Then I talk about news. And I've got essentially two case studies of news. One draws on my work that I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years, which is this idea of the political information cycle, looking at one particularly important scandal in Britain, the Bullygate scandal, and I'll explain why that's important shortly, and also Britain's first live televised prime ministerial debates, which for me were a fascinating moment in hybrid mediation of politics. And I'm also looking at WikiLeaks. More on that soon as well. I look at the sphere of election campaigns and the media's role in them in the American context. So I have a reinterpretation of Barack Obama's famous 2008 victory, and I'm also trying to place that victory within a broader systemic approach to the mediation of election campaigns, which looks at the interaction of old and new media and campaign practices that are organized around the logics of broadcast media that now increasingly interact with campaign practices that are all organized around the logics of online media. It's not either or, it's not only, but also. And then finally, I have 2 years' worth of ethnographic elite interviews that I've conducted with actors from a broad range of spheres in Britain's media and political systems. 38 Degrees that Helen mentioned, I spent some time with those guys, did some really wonderful work with them, learning about how they organize their online activism and how that gels with their very old-fashioned media-centric approach in many ways, the way they target newspapers and broadcast media, and not just online. But also interviews with people working in the senior news production engines, if you will, of British politics, ITN, Channel 4 News, the Today programme, Radio 4, work inside the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and also interviewing bloggers, people working for news agencies, and inside Number 10 Downing Street and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office too. So I'm interested in exploring sense-making, how actors in this system are arriving at a hybrid form of sense-making that crosses over and blurs the boundaries between old and new media logics and practices. So that's the book. Let me just talk a little bit about newsmaking and how this kind of fits. And I want to start with just a basic question, really, which is, how is news constructed today? And I would argue that news is increasingly constructed, certainly in the cases that I've examined in the British context, but I think that this is a model that will travel with different inflections, naturally. I think that news is made in assemblages, and I'll explain what I mean by this shortly. But let me give you an overview of what these case studies are. The 2010 Bullygate scandal in Britain concerned revelations about alleged bullying by the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, of his staff inside 10 Downing Street. And what seemed at first to be very clear-cut revelations published in a national newspaper became the subject of fierce contestation involving competition, conflict, partisanship, but also relations of interdependence among politicians, non-profit group leaders, and professional journalists, bloggers, and citizen activists organized on Twitter. And over the course of a few days, the story was discredited and it collapsed. And the mediation of Britain's first live televised leaders' debate revealed similar dynamics. In this case, conservative newspaper attacks on Liberal Democrat Party leader Nick Clegg, who'd done incredibly well, made a huge breakthrough in that first leaders' debate. These were strongly contested by online activists and professional journalists acting together on Twitter and Facebook, and by sections of the newspaper press and broadcasters. And a supposed Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing newspaper in Britain, scoop story claiming that Nick Clegg had falsified his expenses became the object of ridicule following a satirical online flash campaign organized on Twitter and Facebook, and the story collapsed. So these are two cases of stories effectively being contested very, very quickly, in many cases in real time, by an assemblage of different actors. And they're what I'm calling the political information cycle, to try and get away from this idea of regular daily news cycles. Because believe me, a lot of this stuff takes place in the middle of the night. And I know because these case studies are based upon live research, effectively me sitting there logging material over a period of 5 days, sometimes in my dressing gown, not wanting to miss important details as the stories unfolded. And I found out some fascinating things. So, political information cycles are complex assemblages in which the personnel, the practices, the genres, the technologies, and the temporalities, the sense of timeliness of newer online media are hybridized with those of older broadcast and print media. And power relations among these actors in these assemblages affect the flows and meanings of news. Political information cycles are composed, therefore, of multiple loosely coupled individuals, groups, sites, and temporal instances of interaction involving diverse yet highly interdependent news creators that plug and unplug themselves from the news-making process, often in real time. They involve greater numbers and a more diverse range of actors and interactions than news cycles as they've traditionally been understood. And they contain many non-elite participants, most of whom now interact exclusively online in order to advance or contest news frames. Sometimes this is in real-time exchanges with journalists and politicians. So political information cycles work on the basis of cross-platform iteration and recursion, and this loosens the grip of journalistic and political elites through the creation of fluid opportunity structures that enable timely intervention by online citizen activists. But at the same time, broadcasters and newspapers increasingly try to integrate these non-elite actions and information from the online realm into their own production practices and routines. They seek to outperform each other and the newer media actors in incessant micro-level power struggles. And much of this takes place in public or semi-public online environments. So what I'm arguing is this is increasingly how news is created. So I move finally to another example I want to talk about today, which is WikiLeaks. Now, this has obvious affinities with what I've just discussed, but there's a rather different set of interdependencies going on in the case of WikiLeaks. I want to start by asking a basic question. What is WikiLeaks? Is it a website, an email list, a globally distributed technological infrastructure based on secure encryption standards? Is it a publishing business, a professional investigative online news magazine, a public relations agency acting on behalf of anonymous clients? Is it an elite-centric lobby group, a netroots social movement pressing for radical transparency in all areas of life, or a secretive group of dedicated activists? Is it even a collective of radical poets and artists, a transnational distributed online network of hackers, or even an educational foundation funded by charitable donations? Is it just a loosely connected series of hacker conferences and alternative festivals? Is it truly global or embedded in specific national media systems? Or is it just one person, Julian Assange? Well, the answer, of course, you know what's coming. WikiLeaks is all of these things. It's part news producer, part social movement, part public information provider, part broadcaster, and part direct action network. It leaks, it publishes, it produces, and it mobilizes. And WikiLeaks is also an assemblage of secure hardware and software, networks of interdependent sources, activists, journalists, and media. It's a socio-technical system, and it's effectively what's enabled WikiLeaks to function as a global news-making entity without a central headquarters and staff. So WikiLeaks has co-evolved with other media actors. So for example, the Collateral Murder Iraq helicopter film of early 2010, that saw WikiLeaks partially metamorphose from being a whistleblower's intermediary and activist network to all of a sudden becoming an ideologically committed documentary filmmaker. But this metamorphosis then threatened to undermine its legitimacy as objective journalism. So from that point on, it switched to yet another approach, and by the time of the Afghanistan war logs, release of the summer of 2010, the first big release from WikiLeaks, it had decided that working closely with journalists would be its chief mode of operation, so it switched again, and that's where things got very interdependent. So the big question here, I think, for me, is who has more power in newsmaking, WikiLeaks or the newspapers and broadcasters? And a lot of the public commentary was about that kind of thing when WikiLeaks exploded into the national or international consciousness in 2010. And this is a valid enough question, but I think it's premised on a particular understanding of power. WikiLeaks relies upon anonymous whistleblowers for its source material, and over time it's built a leaking infrastructure that's able to marshal these huge quantities of data. It's also built a publishing infrastructure. But WikiLeaks has also, of course, been very polymorphous, chaotic, often reliant upon the personal resources of its key protagonists, and sometimes, in fact, often, slow to live up to its own ideals. It's inescapable that the leaked information that has had the most impact has been animated and mediated by professional journalism. So this journalism has operated in environments where professional status, experience of investigations, and organizational resources have been important aspects of the picture. So to depict WikiLeaks, or the professional journalists, or the online hacktivist networks, only in terms of each group's power to act upon pre-existing sets of relations, I think is to miss the truly important point. And it's this, which is that in the hybrid media system, no surprise, I suppose, for those who've studied power, power is profoundly relational. It's not always exercised in zero-sum games. It emerges from physical and mediated interactions that are socially and technologically constructed and which evolve over time in a diverse range of settings. So what actually counts as effective resources for powerful action in the hybrid media system have emerged from the interactions between WikiLeaks, the newspaper and broadcast media, and the online activists. And as the chapter in the book tries to show, some of this power is exercised behind closed doors in very discrete, focused environments, such as when, for instance, Julian Assange and his lawyer came together with The Guardian and the New York Times and Der Spiegel and hammered out the last-minute deal in The Guardian's offices in London. But sometimes, of course, power has been dispersed across a broader network, such as when WikiLeaks used its infrastructure to gather data leaks and channel these to newspapers and broadcasters, when it's capitalized on the expertise of activists on the ground in different countries. And of course, this broader network was also on display when online hacktivists came to the symbolic aid of both WikiLeaks and the journalists in the aftermath of the cables leak in December 2010, when the US government attacked their infrastructure. Now, cooperation, as I draw this to a close, has by no means been a frictionless process. There are plenty of examples from the insider accounts of WikiLeaks, including Assange's, of when things have gone wrong and turned bad and conflictual between WikiLeaks and professional journalism. But I would argue that the development of meaningful capacity for action in this new type of technology-enabled, not quite journalism, has involved a process of learning, co-creation, and co-evolution in the creative pursuit of new norms and working practices. So, to conclude, WikiLeaks and their media partners in Britain, America, Germany, France, Spain, and now many other countries have together played an important role in the ongoing construction of a media system in which they have also developed the capacity to so decisively intervene, and that's a hybrid media system. Thanks for listening.